On April 29, 1945, troops from the US 7th Army entered Dachau, the first concentration camp built by the Nazi regime. What they found immediately altered the military logic with which they had been operating for months on the Western Front. Over the next few hours, a series of spontaneous decisions unfolded, all without any court hearing. There were no written orders, no formal processes, and no room for doubt. Instead, there were direct reactions, immediate executions, and a chain of responsibility that dissolved from the outset. Why did the American soldiers act this way? What exactly did they see when they entered the camp? And why were these facts hidden for more than 40 years? Day of Wrath, the immediate massacre after liberation. April 29, 1945, noon. The artificial silence of the Dachau concentration camp was shattered by the roar of Sherman engines. The 45th Infantry Division of the US 7th Army had arrived at the gates of the first regular concentration camp built by the Nazi regime. What happened in the next 4 hours would go down in history as the most systematic summary execution perpetrated by Allied troops during World War II. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Regiment when his men passed through the main gates. German resistance had been minimal. A few shots fired from the watchtowers, quickly silenced when sentries descended with white flags. What transformed a routine surrender into a massacre was the immediate discovery of 39 boxcars packed with human corpses, stacked like cargo. The first murder occurred in Tower B at 12:30 p.m. Lieutenant William Walsh and Sergeant John DeGroe escorted 4 surrendered German soldiers to one of the death cars. Walsh forced the prisoners into the car, closed the door, and shot each one with his service pistol. The screams of agony were cut short by a second shot as another soldier finished off the wounded. This execution established the pattern that would be repeated for the rest of the day: sight of horror, identification of the enemy, immediate elimination. The most extensive slaughter took place in the coal yard. 60 Waffen-SS soldiers had been captured after the initial surrender. Sparks left them in custody while he continued his reconnaissance. Upon his return, he found a .30 caliber machine gun mounted in front of the prisoners. The bodies lay piled against the wall where they had been forced to line up. The responsible soldier, a 19-year-old artilleryman, was in a state of shock, shouting that the Germans had tried to escape. Sparks struck the soldier to stop the killing, but only saved about 20 Germans who were locked in the maintenance barracks. The subsequent military investigation never confirmed whether there was a real escape attempt. Testimony suggests that the young artilleryman, after entering the barracks and seeing mountains of skeletal corpses, suffered a psychological breakdown that caused him to perceive non-existent threats. The violence spread to specific sectors of the camp following a decentralized but systematic pattern. In the industrial zone, a group of soldiers executed 8 Germans who were trying to hide in the workshops. In the medical area, 5 individuals found destroying documents were shot. Near the crematorium, 3 Germans who had exchanged uniforms for prisoners' clothing were identified by surviving inmates and immediately eliminated. Execution methods varied according to the availability of weapons and emotional proximity to the horror. Germans captured near the death wagons were shot with rifles from a distance. Those found in barracks filled with corpses were executed with pistols at point-blank range. Those discovered next to crematorium ovens were bludgeoned to death with helmets and rifle butts, as if direct physical violence were necessary to process the magnitude of the crime witnessed. Captain David Wilsey documented in personal letters how he witnessed 12 individual executions at different locations in the camp. According to his account, each death followed the same sequence: discovery of evidence of atrocity, identification of the nearest German perpetrator, and elimination without interrogation or deliberation. The soldiers acted with lethal automatism, as if executing a mental program triggered by the visual trauma. The formal chain of command had temporarily collapsed. Mid-ranking officers not only permitted the executions but also facilitated them by designating targets or providing ammunition. Lieutenant James Walsh personally distributed pistols to soldiers who had exhausted their ammunition after eliminating groups of Germans. Captain Robert Marcus organized specific patrols to locate Nazi personnel hiding in unrecorded sections of the camp. A distinctive feature was the complete absence of standard military procedures. There were no interrogations to determine individual rank or responsibility. No identification documents were checked, no Geneva Convention protocols were applied to prisoners of war. The mere presence of Germans in the camp constituted sufficient evidence of guilt to warrant immediate execution. The process intensified when soldiers began entering specific barracks. Barrack 32, designated for medical experiments, contained blood-stained surgical instruments and corpses with fresh incisions. The two Germans found they were subjected to the same procedures as their victims, systematic cutting without anesthesia until they died from bleeding. The entire duration of this first wave extended from noon to 4 p.m. During this period, formal military control of the camp remained in American hands, but a parallel system of summary justice operated on its own terms. The soldiers had simultaneously assumed the roles of liberators and executioners, a combination that conventional warfare had rarely produced in such a direct manner. By the end of the day, between 40 and 60 Germans had been executed by American troops. The exact number remains uncertain, due to the deliberate destruction of records and the subsequent institutional desire to minimize the scope of reprisals. However, multiple testimonies confirm that every sector of the camp had been the scene of at least one summary execution. The psychological transformation of the soldiers was immediate and permanent. Veterans who had maintained professionalism during intense combat became ruthless enforcers when faced with direct evidence of genocide. The war had acquired a moral dimension that transcended conventional military rules, justifying methods that in other contexts would have constituted war crimes. The shock of horror what Allied troops found at Dachau. On the morning of April 29th, the soldiers of the 7th Army advanced with the confidence of veterans hardened by multiple campaigns. They had liberated French cities, crossed the Rhine, and defeated German armored divisions. Yet no previous military experience had prepared them to face the systematic engineering of human extermination. The encounter was neither gradual nor mediated by written reports. It was a total sensory impact that instantly disintegrated any previous frame of reference regarding the limits of human cruelty. The first clue came through their sense of smell. 5 kilometers away, the tank drivers detected a scent that intensified as they advanced toward the objective. It was a sweet, nauseating stench that permeated the Bavarian spring air. The veterans knew the smell of death in combat: fresh blood, gunpowder, flesh burned by explosions. This was different. It was thicker, more persistent, more concentrated. It was the scent of industrial death processed over years. The source revealed itself at the train station: 39 freight cars with doors ajar. Inside, naked human bodies lay stacked in various stages of decomposition, some mummified by the cold, others bloated by putrefactive gases. Many bore expressions of terror fixed for eternity, open eyes that seemed to stare accusingly at the liberators. These were not soldiers who had fallen in combat. They were human beings deliberately reduced to skeletons before their deaths. The corpses displayed patterns of starvation that defied medical understanding. Ribs were visible beneath translucent skin, limbs reduced to bone and sinew, bellies sunk to the spine. Private John Lee later described how some remained in positions suggestive of death during desperate escape attempts: hands clutching planks, bodies twisted toward doors, faces directed toward non-existent openings. Upon penetrating the main compound, the magnitude of the horror multiplied exponentially. Additional corpses lay scattered throughout the corridors between barracks, some naked, others covered in rags. The bodies lay where they had fallen, with no one bothering to bury them. Death had occurred so massively in the final days that the evidence disposal system had completely collapsed. The barracks revealed the living dimensions of the genocide. Spaces designed for 200 people held more than 1,600. The wooden bunks, stacked 3 levels high, lacked any basic survival essentials. Without mattresses, blankets, or pillows, the prisoners slept on bare planks when they managed to sleep. The floor was covered with human filth that had fermented for months: excrement, vomit, urine, and blood forming a paste that stuck to their boots. The survivors presented a picture that transcended any known category of human suffering. 30,000 people were reduced to walking skeletons with blank stares and automaton-like movements. They had lost basic communication skills, limiting themselves to extending trembling hands in universal gestures of supplication. Their bodies bore evidence of years of systematic malnutrition: missing teeth, thinning hair, prematurely wrinkled skin, limbs atrophied from disuse. Lieutenant William Cowling recounted how the experience produced a sense of unreality, like witnessing a nightmare too extreme to be authentic. The human mind, he explained, lacked the mechanisms to process such concentrated cruelty. It was necessary to create emotional distance to continue functioning, but that distance frequently transformed into fury directed at any available German. The crematorium added a technical dimension to the horror. The ovens held skeletal remains from the last cremation carried out hours before the Allied arrival. Mountains of human ash piled up in metal containers next to the ovens. Nazi personnel had attempted to eliminate evidence until the last moment, but the rate of death outstripped the incineration capacity. An adjacent room contained an airtight chamber with fake showers, evidencing the systematic planning of the extermination. The soldiers' reactions followed predictable but extreme psychological patterns. Some experienced immediate emotional breakdowns, uncontrollable crying, vomiting to the point of exhaustion, and temporary immobility from shock. Others developed furious responses that led them to immediately seek out those responsible for physical revenge. A third group adopted a protective coldness that transformed them into efficient executors of summary justice. Captain David Wilsey documented how he found blood-stained surgical instruments in medical experiment rooms, alongside corpses with fresh incisions that evidenced systematic torture disguised as scientific research. The sight of skeletal children with experimental wounds provoked several soldiers into violent outbursts, which they immediately directed at any Germans present. This psychological transformation fundamentally altered the codes of combat that had guided these troops throughout the war. The protocols for treating prisoners, designed for conflicts between regular armies, proved inadequate in the face of evidence of systematic genocide. The response was neither calculated nor planned. It was instinctive, visceral, and directed toward eliminating every vestige of the system responsible. The encounter at Dachau redefined war for these soldiers. They were no longer fighting against an enemy army, but against an ideology that had turned mass murder into state policy. The liberation of the camp represented not simply a military victory, but a direct confrontation with absolute evil that required equally absolute responses. Architecture of suffering, Dachau as a system of repression. The Dachau concentration camp emerged as the architectural manifestation of an ideology that systematically planned the elimination of its political enemies. Opened on March 22, 1933, it represented the first Nazi experiment in repressive social engineering, the laboratory where methods were designed that would later be exported to the entire Reich concentration camp system. Over 12 years, it evolved from a political detention center to an industrial extermination by exhaustion complex. Theodor Eicke, appointed commandant in June 1933, transformed Dachau into the definitive organizational model. Eicke developed a comprehensive system based on three principles: preemptive terror through disproportionate punishment, progressive dehumanization through the elimination of individual identity, and labor exploitation designed to accelerate death. His internal regulations, camp discipline and order, became the operating manual replicated in all subsequent camps. Preventive terror operated through brutal punishments for minor infractions. Speaking without permission resulted in 25 lashes publicly administered. Looking directly at a guard led to isolation in unventilated cells for weeks. Any gesture interpreted as resistance resulted in summary execution in front of other prisoners. The goal was not to correct behavior, but to psychologically break the inmates, transforming them into obedient automatons incapable of organized resistance. Dehumanization began upon entry with the systematic elimination of all personal identity. Prisoners lost their names, replaced by numbers tattooed or sewn onto their uniforms. Personal belongings, family photographs, letters, and religious objects were confiscated. The striped uniform erased individual distinctions, turning thousands of people into a uniform, interchangeable mass. This process deliberately erased humanity in preparation for physical annihilation. The physical structure reflected this philosophy of total control. The compound was divided into zones with specific but interconnected functions. The administrative area processed the paperwork that turned human beings into statistics. The residential barracks were arranged to facilitate constant surveillance from strategically placed towers. The industrial zone expanded according to the needs of the Nazi regime, transforming labor into an instrument of torture. The labor system constituted the central mechanism of gradual extermination. Prisoners worked 12 to 14 hours a day building roads with inadequate tools, extracting gravel without protective equipment, and draining swamps prone to deadly diseases. The labor lacked any real productive purpose. It was systematic torture disguised as economic activity, designed to accelerate physical deterioration until death. Beginning in 1942, Dachau became a center for human medical experimentation. Dr. Sigmund Rascher conducted tests simulating extreme conditions for German pilots, altitude experiments subjecting prisoners to lethal atmospheric pressures, hypothermia tests immersing naked individuals in icy water, and pharmacological trials injecting pathogens into healthy subjects to observe the development of fatal infections. Punishment methods operated with bureaucratic precision. Specific categories of infractions existed, with corresponding penalties. Minor offenses were punished with reduced food or additional labor. Intermediate offenses entailed public whipping or prolonged solitary confinement. Serious offenses were punished with elaborate torture. The post suspended prisoners from beams, dislocating their shoulders. The rabbit run forced them to run toward electrified wire fences, providing an excuse to shoot them. The camp's evolution over time reflected the progressive radicalization of the regime. During its early years, it focused on German political enemies, communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Beginning in 1935, it incorporated anti-social groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, gypsies, and vagrants. With the war, internationalization began. Soviet prisoners, French resistance fighters, Yugoslav partisans, and Czech intellectuals. The medical area officially functioned to maintain the health of inmates, but it actually served as a laboratory for scientific torture. Amputations were performed without anesthesia to study surgical techniques. Radiation sterilizations were used to test population control, and experimental injections of lethal drugs were used to analyze their effects on weakened organisms. These procedures lacked medical justification. They were systematic torture disguised as research. Executions were a daily part of the regime. Initially carried out in the courtyard of the bunker, an internal prison for rebels, a special shooting range was later built for mass executions. Between 1941 and 1942, more than 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war were executed there following the invasion of the Soviet Union. The executions followed bureaucratic procedures: selection, documentation, physical elimination, and statistical recording. Dachau also served as an administrative center, coordinating a network of 140 subcamps spread across southern Germany. From there, transfers, selections for extermination at other centers, and orders to subordinate camps were organized. Its central office meticulously kept records of admissions, punishments, deaths, and releases, maintaining detailed files documenting every aspect of the systematic extermination process. Each of these subcamps was linked to German war production. Allach, for example, was a BMW factory where prisoners worked in aircraft engine manufacturing. In Mühldorf, tunnels were built for secret weapons. The mortality rate in some of these subcamps exceeded 40%, making the Dachau-dependent network an autonomous labor extermination system. The layout of the main camp followed a strictly rational geometric design. A central axis led from the entrance to the crematorium, passing through administrative areas, barracks, and punishment areas. This layout was not accidental. It was designed to optimize the movement of prisoners under constant surveillance. The guard towers, aligned at regular intervals, provided visual coverage without blind spots. In the archive of the camp's original plans, preserved at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, one can see how even the sanitary facilities were designed without any privacy: communal showers, open latrines, and doorless corridors. Every element sought to reinforce the systematic defenselessness. The architecture of Dachau was, in itself, a tool of humiliation. The final collapse began in January 1945, when evacuations from eastern camps overwhelmed the facility's capacity. Prisoners arrived on unheated trains after days without food or water. Many died during transport. Survivors arrived in critical condition beyond the medical system's ability to treat. Epidemics spread uncontrollably, especially louse-borne typhus among weakened inmates. Preemptive executions were carried out before the evacuations. Sick prisoners or prisoners unable to march were eliminated so as not to slow down the transfer. Medical records found after the liberation contain notes such as unfit, suppressed. These documents confirm that selection for extermination continued even in the final days of the regime. The last camp commander, N4ZI, ordered the burning of documents and archives just before fleeing. The flames consumed part of the administrative wing, but not all records were destroyed. Thanks to documents recovered by US troops, lists of prisoners, work shifts, and sanctions imposed up to April were reconstructed. In its final months, Dachau had lost its functionality as a work center, becoming simply a death machine overwhelmed by its own efficiency. Hundreds of prisoners died daily from disease, starvation, or summary execution. The corpses piled up faster than they could be cremated, creating additional sources of infection that accelerated the total disintegration of the system. The executioners among us, the SS escape attempt. In the crucial hours before the American arrival, a desperate survival operation unfolded in the least guarded sections of Dachau. The SS members, aware of their inevitable fate, began a transformation that required not only changing their uniforms, but also erasing years of authority exercised through systematic brutality. This metamorphosis faced an unforeseen obstacle: the collective memory of thousands of prisoners who had observed their torturers' every gesture during years of captivity. Planning had begun weeks earlier when reports of the Allied advance described the fate of those responsible in liberated camps. There would be no tribunals or protracted trials. Justice would be immediate and lethal. Camouflage methods varied according to available resources, exchanging uniforms with corpses of similar size, removing documents from dead prisoners, modifying physical appearance through haircuts and deliberately dirtying faces. The clothing exchange was only the first step. The SS had to transform behaviors acquired during years of exercising absolute power. They had to learn to walk hunched over, avoid direct eye contact, and show deference to authority. Decades of military training in erect posture and a steady gaze had to be replaced by the submission characteristic of the victims of the system they had administered. However, these efforts faced the relentless precision of traumatic memory. Survivors knew specific voices, particular scars, individual nervous tics, characteristic gaits. They remembered who led selections for execution, who distributed insufficient rations as punishment, who ordered torture in the bunker. When American soldiers requested help distinguishing between genuine prisoners and disguised Nazi personnel, the response was immediate and lethal. The first discovery involved a man trying to pass himself off as a German political prisoner. His overly upright posture and excessively clean hands aroused initial suspicion. When inmates examined him, several identified him as the SS Unterscharführer responsible for food distribution, known for deliberately reducing rations as collective punishment. His execution was immediate, bludgeoned to death with tools the prisoners had hidden for this purpose. Another case involved an individual with identification papers belonging to a deceased Czech prisoner. His inability to respond in Czech instantly gave him away. Czech survivors confirmed they knew the real bearer of that ID, who had died weeks earlier of tuberculosis. The imposter was identified as a guard supervising executions in the bunker courtyard, responsible for at least 50 deaths documented by multiple witnesses. Spontaneously developed verification methods revealed a deep understanding of camouflage techniques. Prisoners examined hands for calluses from manual labor, checked for dental deterioration due to malnutrition, and observed instinctive reactions to commands in German. The real inmates had developed automatic submissive responses that the imposters could not convincingly replicate. American soldiers quickly verified the effectiveness of these identifications. In several cases, they confronted defendants with specific evidence, exact dates of punishments, names of specific victims, descriptions of individualized torture methods. The precision was too detailed to be fabricated, convincing the liberators to proceed with summary executions based solely on survivor testimony. An additional technique employed by the prisoners was to replicate daily camp routines. Suspects were ordered to line up or respond to commands in German. The way they obeyed instructions revealed their prior training. Several infiltrators were discovered by adopting rigid postures or taking positions reserved for command staff. Some SS men attempted complete escape by using drainage tunnels, openings in barbed wire fences, or walking into woods during the final confusion. Many were captured by American patrols or handed over by German civilians who feared reprisals for harboring war criminals. At the Dachau train station, 4 individuals dressed as railroad workers were arrested when they could not explain their presence. One of them had worked as a supervisor of prisoner transports from Buchenwald. At the same time, the inmates sealed secondary exits from the camp and blocked hidden entrances with improvised materials. This prevented the escape of at least 8 SS members who were attempting to escape in civilian clothes through the crematorium area. There were also attempts to disguise themselves as medical personnel or patients. In the operating rooms, Allied soldiers discovered 2 SS officers posing as orderlies. One was identified by a Czech nurse by a scar on his neck and executed shortly afterward. In another case, an officer was discovered in the camp kitchen wearing a stolen white coat and a triangle falsely sewn onto his uniform. The organized prisoners established systematic patrols, searching each barracks for infiltrators. These groups were able to distinguish not only regular SS men, but also capos, collaborators, and prisoners who had voluntarily participated in the repression. Checkpoints were established in each sector of the camp where inmates were required to identify themselves, show their palms, and answer questions about their routine. The identification process relied on seemingly insignificant but revealing details, the way they held eating utensils, involuntary reactions to specific sounds, and extensive knowledge of the camp's internal routines. The real prisoners had developed particular survival behaviors that the impostors could not imitate. This forced proximity between executioners and victims, designed to maximize control and humiliation, became a guarantee that there would be no escape when the time came for reckoning. The smallest signs became definitive criteria: how a spoon was held, a reaction to hearing a siren, knowledge of the barrack's internal layout. Anything could betray an imposter. On at least 8 occasions, these observations allowed for the precise identification of Nazi personnel disguised as prisoners. Errors were inevitable but minimal. At least 2 genuine prisoners were executed for mistaken identity, but the overall accuracy of the system was remarkably high. German civilians in the village also handed over suspects, fearing Allied reprisals for harboring criminals. Some arrived with their hands tied, claiming to have been caught hiding in barns or cellars. Arrests outside the camp were also documented. On the outskirts of Pacing, 6 kilometers away, a wounded SS man was found hiding in a stable by local peasants. A photograph circulated by soldiers betrayed him. 3 Hungarian witnesses confirmed his identity. He was executed on the spot. Summary justice operated for 72 hours. There were no records or bureaucratic procedures. If 3 or more survivors independently identified him as a member of the surveillance or repression apparatus, execution was immediate. This unwritten rule was applied with a precision that surprised even American officials. Revenge of captivity, the prisoners' settling of scores. Once the German resistance was neutralized, a system of justice emerged that transcended the simple division between liberators and the freed. Surviving prisoners possessed detailed information about the complex internal hierarchies that had facilitated the daily operation of terror. They knew of capos who had brutalized fellow prisoners for extra rations, informants who reported escape attempts, and medical collaborators who selected victims for lethal experiments. This web of complicity became the target of a settling of scores as precise as it was relentless. The capos represented the prime target of organized revenge. These prisoners, selected by the SS to exercise authority over their fellow prisoners, had developed methods of brutality that frequently exceeded Nazi standards. Alexander Weiss was directly involved in the capture of a capo nicknamed Der Metzger, known for organizing punishment competitions between prisoners, forcing them to beat each other while he selected the winners for extra rations. The execution of Der Metzger followed a specific ritual of poetic justice. He was dragged to the courtyard where he had humiliated hundreds of inmates, systematically beaten with the same implements he used for torture, and finally abandoned, dying in the exact spot where he had exercised his power. His body remained exposed for 2 days as a warning to other collaborators who might try to hide among the survivors. In the Soviet sector, a parallel trial was conducted against a translator who had served as an intermediary between the SS and Russian inmates. The prisoners had mentally documented every denunciation that resulted in executions, keeping precise lists of comrades killed for their betrayals. His execution included the same pole punishment he had recommended for others: wire tied to a metal frame, shoulder dislocation, and beaten with tools until he died slowly. The women organized specialized revenge against female capos who participated in sexual abuse and selection for sterilization experiments. A German capo who assisted in identifying radiation victims was captured by Hungarian survivors and executed with blades hidden for months. The cuts were applied slowly and deliberately, prolonging agony for hours in retaliation for years of complicity in medical torture. Informants without official positions required more complex identification through multiple testimonies and cross-checking between different national groups. A Czech prisoner who systematically reported foreign communications had feigned involvement in clandestine activities to obtain information that he then handed over to the SS. His pattern was detected when each operation he participated in resulted in the arrest and execution of its organizers. The elimination of this informant took place in the workshop where he had faked sabotage. The prisoners used tools confiscated after his previous denunciations, hammers and wrenches to fracture major bones, ensuring prolonged consciousness to experience pain equivalent to that caused by his betrayals. The process lasted all night, during which other inmates recited names of victims of his denunciations. The hospital became the scene of particular reprisals against medical assistants who participated in the selection of victims for experiments or euthanasia. These collaborators were ironically subjected to the very procedures they had facilitated: injections of extremely painful substances, surgeries without anesthesia, and exposure to extreme temperatures. The prisoners deliberately applied experimental protocols identical to those used on innocent victims. Manual searches were also carried out in the administrative barracks to identify prisoners who had been promoted by the SS to lesser positions. Some had served as interpreters, in charge of distributing clothing or food, or as designated night watchmen. Although not all were executed, at least 12 were documented as having been publicly beaten and violently removed from any position of influence within the camp. Hidden notes were found in the crematorium containing lists of names written by Polish and French inmates, detailing internal collaborations during the final months of the regime. These lists were used as a basis for forming small improvised field courts, where at least 3 prisoners briefly debated the degree of responsibility of the accused before issuing a direct sentence. One of the most well-documented cases was that of a former German boxer who served as a capo of physical discipline. He had been recruited by the SS for his ability to control Soviet prisoners. After liberation, he was forced to fight a group of inmates as a form of public humiliation. Defeated and disfigured, he was hanged from the door of his own barracks. American soldiers adopted a policy of non-intervention in these internal processes. Officially, they maintained control of the camp, but in practice, they allowed survivors to organize their own mechanisms of justice. This permissiveness reflected both practical limitations and moral considerations. Troops lacked information about complex internal hierarchies and relied on knowledge of victims to identify individual responsibilities. The execution methods reflected specific symbolism associated with particular crimes. Capos who had been starved were forced to consume inedible substances until they died. Informants who reported escape attempts were hanged with the same ropes used in previous executions. Medical collaborators underwent procedures identical to those used on experimental victims. Documentation of these events was deliberately limited. The organized prisoners destroyed evidence, buried bodies in improvised mass graves, and avoided creating records that could later be used against them. Justice had been administered according to codes developed during years of clandestine resistance, and its enforcers did not seek external legitimacy or official recognition from military authorities. In total, it is estimated that the prisoners carried out between 20 and 25 executions per day during the first 3 days after liberation. In some cases, the bodies were discreetly moved to wooded areas near the camp perimeter. Mass graves were dug there, which have not yet been fully documented. The incidents also included internal reprisals between nationalities. Some pent-up tensions between ethnic groups briefly surfaced during the power vacuum. On one occasion, a group of Yugoslav inmates attacked 3 Lithuanian prisoners accused of collaborating with the Nazi administration. Only one survived. The entire process lasted 72 hours, resulting in the elimination of between 40 and 60 collaborators identified through multiple testimonies. At its conclusion, a new hierarchy emerged among survivors based on the resilience demonstrated during captivity. Those who had maintained solidarity under extreme pressure assumed natural leadership in organizing post-captivity life, while those who survived through complicity had been eliminated or permanently marginalized. This internal purge revealed dimensions of the concentration camp system absent from official liberation narratives. Dachau had not simply been a place where Germans tortured foreigners, but a complex ecosystem where victims also developed mechanisms of collaboration and resistance. Liberation provided an opportunity to settle scores, not only with official executioners, but also with those who facilitated their own survival at the expense of fellow prisoners. Dachau, after the final settlement, the camp converted into a war tribunal following the initial massacre and the stabilization of the site by the US Army. Dachau was neither dismantled nor closed. Instead, the former concentration camp was repurposed as an operational base for military and judicial functions. For 3 years, it became the primary center for legal prosecution of Nazi crimes committed in concentration camps, particularly those not addressed by the Nuremberg Tribunal. Beginning in May 1945, the US military authorities used Dachau as an internment center for captured Nazi personnel. Former SS members, camp doctors, administrators, capos, civilians suspected of collaborating, and low-ranking guards were imprisoned in the same barracks where they had been executioners weeks earlier. The bunker cells were repurposed without structural modifications to isolate more prominent suspects. The remaining barracks were refurbished to house hundreds of detainees awaiting trial. Under the jurisdiction of the Third Army, the so-called Dachau trials were organized, a series of judicial proceedings that began in November 1945 and continued until August 1948. In total, more than 460 trials were held involving approximately 1,672 defendants. The courts operated under the authority of Allied military law and followed a standardized structure: indictment, presentation of documentary evidence, eyewitnesses, verdict, and execution of the sentence. Appeals were rare, and sentences were carried out swiftly. The first major trial was against the Mauthausen camp staff, in which 61 defendants faced charges of crimes against humanity. 49 were sentenced to death. Similar trials followed against staff at Buchenwald, Flossenburg, and Dora Mittelbau. All these trials were held within the Dachau area, using a converted courtroom in the camp's former administrative building. Geographical proximity to the crimes was considered a logistical and symbolic advantage by the Allied authorities. Death sentences were carried out on the land adjacent to the former crematorium area. A portable gallows capable of multiple executions was installed there. The condemned were transported in small groups from the barracks to the designated location. According to military records, at least 324 people were executed by hanging between 1946 and 1948. The executions were carried out without the presence of the press, civilians, or outside observers. Only relevant military personnel and a doctor were allowed to be present. In parallel with the trials, Dachau was used as an interrogation center for key members of the Nazi regime. The G2 section of the Military Intelligence Department established offices within the camp, from which they coordinated interviews, document analysis, and information gathering on SS operational structures, the location of useful scientists, and still active clandestine networks. Some low-ranking personnel were released or recruited as informants in exchange for partial immunity, especially those with technical or logistical expertise. This reappropriation of the camp contrasted with its symbolic representation in the public narrative. While the American media described Dachau as the epitome of Nazi horror, its facilities were functionally used to prosecute those responsible. No significant adaptations were made to transform the space into a memorial site. The watchtowers remained standing, the barracks remained in use, and the crematorium remained closed but intact. In internal operational reports, Dachau was described as a field justice center, which allowed its widespread use to be justified without the need for civilian intervention. This characterization was useful in avoiding the transfer of thousands of defendants to other locations in Germany. The logistics, the already available resources, and the geographical location close to Munich made the camp an ideal hub for large-scale judicial proceedings. The success of the trials there was cited as an example for future legal interventions in post-war settings. In 1948, following the formal closure of the judicial proceedings and the dissolution of the temporary military tribunals, Dachau was handed over to German civilian administration. The gradual dismantling of the compound was ordered, beginning with the wooden barracks and structures associated with judicial operations. Only the crematorium, the entrance building, and some sections of the perimeter wall were preserved, which would later form part of the future memorial. The remains of those executed during the trials were buried in mass graves within the grounds. No monuments or memorial plaques were erected. Records relating to the executions remained classified for decades and were stored at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Public reconstruction of the trials only began decades later, when archival pressure and demands from victims' families led to the partial declassification of the documents. During these 3 years, Dachau functioned as a transitional space between two eras, that of industrialized terror and that of military legality. It was the scene of extermination, massacre, summary justice, formal justice, administrative execution, and finally, bureaucratic closure. Its history between 1945 and 1948 represents a little-known but crucial phase of the immediate accountability process applied to the Nazi repressive apparatus. A phase in which memory was not yet a priority and operational functionality dominated the narrative. Military silence, the U.S. Army's cover-up. The Dachau massacre confronted the U.S. High Command with an unprecedented dilemma. Allied soldiers had summarily executed dozens of German prisoners in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. The institutional response was a cover-up operation that would keep these events classified for 4 decades, demonstrating the military's ability to control historical narratives when sufficient political incentives existed. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks sent the first official report on April 30th describing successful control of the objective with minimal enemy resistance. The document deliberately omitted summary executions, characterizing German casualties as the result of combat during surrender. This initial version established the pattern of distortion that would persist for decades, acknowledgement of basic facts while systematically omitting controversial aspects. General Dwight D. Eisenhower received internal cables on May 2nd mentioning incidents involving German prisoners without specifying their exact nature. Eisenhower, managing the total collapse of the Reich, delegated the investigation to regional commands without requesting immediate details. This downward delegation allowed local officials to control the scope and direction of any subsequent review of the events. General George S. Patton assumed responsibility for the on-site assessment, visiting Dachau on May 5th. His reaction was categorical. Any action taken by American troops had been justified by the circumstances uncovered. Patton adopted a philosophy that prioritized results over procedures, considering the methods employed secondary compared to the magnitude of the German crimes uncovered. Third Army internal protocol stipulated that all executions of prisoners must be reported within 24 hours, but this procedure was deliberately ignored. Internal documents indicate that at least 5 mid-level officers signed falsified reports that omitted explicit mention of executions. Captain Raymond Dumont, the deputy intelligence officer, was one of those responsible for drafting memos that veered toward euphemisms such as unscheduled hostile neutralization. Pressure from international organizations and war correspondents who heard rumors forced the Army to order a formal investigation in June. Lieutenant General Joseph T. McNarney was charged with reviewing all aspects of the liberation. His investigation operated under implicit restrictions. He did not interview privates who were direct witnesses. He did not seek testimony from survivors who witnessed events, and he did not attempt to accurately quantify the number of Germans executed. McNarney's report, completed in August, objectively documented key facts. It confirmed executions of German soldiers after their surrender, identified responsible officers, and described the motivating emotional circumstances. It concluded unequivocally that rules of war established by international treaties had been violated. However, it recommended against prosecuting American personnel, arguing that exceptional circumstances justified the actions taken. Among the report's classified annexes was a document titled Political Implications of Proceedings Against Liberation Troops, drafted by Joint Chiefs of Staff advisors. It warned that the opening of trials for the Dachau executions could have devastating effects on the international perception of the United States as a civilizing force in Europe. This argument was key to McNarney filing the report as Class A restricted material. Patton immediately adopted the recommendations, issuing a general order on September 6, officially closing the investigation. The order declared a lack of evidence of misconduct, attributing rumors of summary executions to confusion during combat or enemy propaganda intended to discredit Allied forces. This version became established as the official narrative that would persist for decades. The implementation of the cover-up required specific information control measures. All related documents were classified as sensitive national security material. Participating officers received explicit orders not to discuss facts with journalists, historians, or military personnel not directly involved. Systematic monitoring was established to detect unauthorized leaks. The War Department issued an internal circular, Document 117B, restricting the use of the term Dachau in post-war reports related to disciplinary actions. Public relations offices were instructed to omit mention of the incident in press materials, official history textbooks, and awards campaigns. The word was only authorized for use in humanitarian release contexts. War correspondents faced systematic obstacles, denial of access to witnesses, delays in providing requested documents, and questions about their patriotism when they persisted with sensitive investigations. Several journalists were reassigned when their investigations strayed too close to the truth about controversial events at Dachau. A confidential Counterintelligence Corps CYC report, dated July 1945, warned of possible summary justice actions carried out without command oversight at least 2 additional facilities, but it was shelved without follow-up as cases of limited impact. This precedent demonstrates that the Dachau cover-up was not an isolated case, but part of a broader strategy to avoid post-war litigation against Allied troops. The silence effectively continued until the 1970s, when generational changes in military leadership and new concerns about government transparency created pressure to review classified episodes. The civil rights movements had raised public awareness about abuses of authority, creating a receptive environment for questioning previously unchallenged official actions. In 1980, Dr. Howard Buechner published The Hour of the Avenger, a detailed account of the events witnessed, including names, dates, and specific descriptions of the methods employed. Although initially met with skepticism, the book prompted journalistic investigations that corroborated its contents, generating public pressure to reconsider blanket classification policies. Buechner, a military doctor stationed at Dachau, also included facsimiles of original medical notes and anatomical drawings documenting gunshot wounds not compatible with combat, reinforcing the authenticity of his testimony. The publisher faced legal pressure from the Department of Defense, although it was unsuccessful in preventing publication due to civil rights laws in Colorado, where the author resided. In 1986, 41 years later, the McNarney report was partially declassified under pressure from human rights organizations. The document officially confirmed what had been rumored for decades. American soldiers summarily executed German prisoners at Dachau, and the fact had been deliberately covered up for decades. The declassification sparked public debate about the morality of the actions and the justification for the subsequent cover-up. Military historians argued that the executions, although technically illegal, were understandable under the circumstances. International law experts maintained that no circumstances justified violations of the Geneva Convention. Veterans were divided between those who defended the actions as poetic justice and those who lamented the stain on the U.S. military record. The U.S. Senate requested an archival review of other military reports sealed between 1945 and 1950, which led to the discovery of supplementary documents on Dachau stored at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. However, the full declassification process stalled after it was determined that some cited sources remained alive and under military identity protection. The legacy of the cover-up transcended the specific episode to become a precedent for the handling of sensitive information in military operations. It demonstrated the institutional capacity to maintain secrecy for extended periods when sufficient political incentives existed. But it also revealed the limitations of such operations when political and generational contexts change. The truth about Dachau finally emerged not because of institutional decision, but because of external pressure and cultural changes that made silence unsustainable. The cover-up had protected the image of US forces during the critical period of establishing post-war order, but it could not permanently eliminate evidence that even the liberators had been temporarily corrupted by the brutality of the system they were destroying. The events of April 29, 1945, stand as testimony that in just wars, justice itself can be corrupted by direct exposure to absolute evil. Military cover-up was effective as a temporary strategy, but inadequate as a permanent solution to complex moral dilemmas. Historical truth, though delayed for decades, eventually found ways to emerge when political and cultural conditions made it inevitable.